sort of that long-run optimum that we said earlier might be the target for central bank policy. Suppose we had a situation where there's no output gap, there's no inflation gap, and so we have a situation where there's really no need for any kind of corrective policy, any type of response to a deviation from the optimum. And if we go to the basic approach that most people would use with the Taylor rule, they would say that the real rate of interest, the risk-free real rate of interest is 2%. The inflation target is 2%. So in that situation, we would have a federal funds rate of approximately 4%. Okay? And you remember some of our earlier discussion we looked at, and we will again today, we looked at that dot plot about the levels of the federal funds rate that members of the Federal Open Market Committee thought might be prevalent in years to come. And you recall that we talked about if we were to drop back at least a year or two, most of those dots for the long run would be clustered right around that 4% level. Okay, and so that has been really since about the early 2000s, that has been sort of the prevailing wisdom about what the long-run federal funds rate is, or should be, I should say, in an ideal situation where we had no output gap and no inflation gap. Obviously, we are a long way from that, a very, very long way from that, okay? So, quite obviously, federal policy, Fed policy, has expressed a very clear concern about, in our context, from the last recession, the output gap that has existed. All right, but let's sort of play this out a little bit here. We said that we could also have an expansionary gap situation. In this particular case, there's no output gap. The economy is performing as well as it could, but there is inflation in the economy. In this particular case, inflation is 5%. What would we expect the federal funds rate to be? Well, again, using the formula and the weights that we have from the basic Taylor formula, federal funds rate would be up about 8.5%. Okay, again, very, very different than where we are right now. However, if we were to go back to the 1980s, that's sort of some of the scenario that we might have seen back then. Federal funds rate well into the 6, 7, 8% range. And so this sort of recaptures some of that. Again, to sort of put this into more common to what we have right now, or at least had several years ago, I think is probably the best way to put it. We have, again, real rate of interest of 2%, inflation target of 2%. Inflation is only 1% in this little scenario. We have an output gap of minus 5%, and that's essentially what we had in 2009. And so, again, if we plug the numbers into the basic formula, this is what we would get, essentially saying that the federal funds rate should be zero in that kind of a situation. And if we were to sort of plot this out, your textbook's got a nice little graph here, kind of illustrate what the rate implied by the Taylor rule would be, and that's the line in red. The line in green is what the actual announced Federal Open Market Committee target was. And you can see that, again, in this particular analysis, going back to the early 90s, we could, again, go back earlier, but that's what this particular graphic does. You can see that it tracks relatively well. Some deviations, quite obviously. During the mid-1990s, the actual rates set by the Federal Open Market Committee were greater than those implied by the Taylor rule. Probably one of the more contentious discussions regarding the similarity between what the Taylor rule says and what the actual Open Market Committee targets were occurs in the early 2000s. You can see the Taylor rule would suggest a rate somewhere up and around the 2%. Instead, the rates set by the Federal Open Market Committee were closer to 1%, actually a little bit below that at one point. And so there was a fairly large divergence there. Some people some folks who very closely follow Federal Reserve policymaking have argued that these rates were too stimulative, too concerned about the recession in 2001, and that very low federal funds rate and correspondingly other low interest rates in the economy because of, again, the term structure of interest rates. That was one of the reasons that contributed to the recession in 2008. Okay? And of course, you can see the response there. The Federal Open Market Committee's response, again, is very similar to what the Taylor rule would predict. The red line here being below zero, simply indicating what the Taylor rule would say that should have negative interest rates. All right, we can't really do that for the federal funds rate, but it is suggesting that the need for some kind of stimulative monetary policy is very much there. Okay, all right. So let's sort of say that. All right, well, that's a rule. Then maybe we can look at other different ways of interpreting what that rule is. All right? I said that those coefficients A and B can take on different values. All right? We could also, as I suggested earlier, play some other games with some elements of this. Let's take, again, a fairly simple situation here where, again, we would have a situation where there's no inflation, no inflationary gap, no output gap, and so 4% would be our long-run equilibrium rate. Let's suppose that the real rate of interest, okay, the real risk-free rate of interest for the economy, instead of being 2%, is 1.5%. All right? So, well, why would you do that? Well, we've got to sort of come back to the whole notion of what we mean by the risk-free real rate of interest. All right? And those of you who've had a macro class, intermediate macro class, you're probably introduced to this notion of the marginal productivity of capital for the economy as a whole. The notion that there is a growth rate for the economy based on the productivity of capital. That's essentially the opportunity cost of using capital in either consumption or investment. And that real rate of interest really mirrors that marginal productivity of capital. So when we say that the federal funds rate should be 2%, or we say that it should be 1.5%, what we're really saying there is that we think that the overall levels of productivity in the economy are different. In the second case, they are lower than what we might have expected if we said that those rates are 2%. What does that imply? Well, again, plugging those numbers in, even with an optimum situation, no output or inflationary gap, we now add this up and we see that we have a new long-run equilibrium rate of interest. Instead of 4%, it's now 3.5%. If we were to lower this number further, okay, and say that the real productivity in the economy is only 1%, well then you can see that the new long-run equilibrium would be about 3%. And so this decision about what we say the long-run productivity of the economy is has a very important role in actually implementing the Taylor rule. All right? And that's part of what many people have started to argue. While the Taylor rule looks very simple, there's also some different interpretations that one can give to that Taylor rule. Similarly, take a situation now where instead of using the equal weights for the inflation gap and for the output gap, suppose I play some games with those coefficients. Coefficients are A and B. Right? Suppose that I say that coefficient A is 0.2 and coefficient B is 0.8. All right? Go back to the basic formula again and remember that A is the coefficient for the inflation gap, B is the coefficient for the output gap. And so when we do this, and we say that we have different values here, they're no longer equal, B is equal to 0.8. What am I saying about my monetary policy reaction function?
It's more weight on the output gap.
More weight on the output gap, yeah. So in the talking about the steepness of the monetary policy reaction function, this would be a fairly flat monetary policy reaction function, because any changes in inflation, I'm really not going to respond to very much. Okay? And so, what this alternative formula for the Taylor rule would tell me is that I would have a different interest rate, a different federal funds rate, that would be my policy choice, depending on what those weights were. And so again, now if I plug this in, here in this situation, you can see that we would have approximately a 0.7 level of the federal funds rate. That would be very different than if I were to use this with the standard formula here. Again, implying that the decisions about what coefficients to use in the Taylor rule are really going to reflect what our monetary policy choices are. All right, and this aspect of the Taylor rule has gotten a lot of publicity recently. One of the people who sort of weighed in on the discussion about the Taylor rule is Ben Bernanke. I think we all remember Ben Bernanke, former chairman of the Federal Reserve, chair of the Federal Open Market Committee. A lot of people have started arguing, well, you know, this Taylor rule is kind of interesting. Maybe we should sort of say that this should play some explicit role in making monetary policy. And Bernanke sort of come back and said that, well, yeah, it's an interesting rule, but you got to realize that the choice of those coefficients is really up to policymakers. All right, you can't sort of hotwire the choice that John Taylor did way back in the early 1990s. He said, well, you know, I'm going to apply these coefficients of 0.5 and 0.5 and say we're going to give equal weights to the output gap and the inflation gap because that's essentially what the dual mandate says. Bernanke and others have sort of come back and argued that, well, you know, this may not be a good way to reflect the way policy is made, and more importantly, it may not actually be a very good predictor. All right, and so Bernanke sort of said, okay, well, let's play a little game here. All right, this is what the Taylor rule would predict. That's the green line that you see here, and the actual federal funds rate is the dotted line that you see there. This is calculated using those 0.5 weights. Okay, and you can see it tracks relatively well, but there's obvious gaps. And again, I've pointed out some of those time periods when that gap would occur. Bernanke came back and said, okay, well, you know, I'm going to play a game. All right? I'm going to now say that I'm going to use a 1.0 weight on the output gap. All right? We as central bankers, and particularly those in the United States, really care about the output gap because that's tied to unemployment. That's part of our dual mandate. And so I'm going to use that 1.0 weight in the Taylor rule and now say, well, what does that give me in terms of predictive power? Or another way of saying that is, how well does that track what the Federal Open Market Committee actually did? Well, and what you can see is that it actually tracks pretty darn well. It certainly follows exactly what the actual choices were. You can see the divergence here in those different periods that I talked about versus here. And again, one would say that, well, if we were saying, well, what is the implied actual Taylor rule that the Federal Open Market Committee was using? It certainly looks a lot more like this than it does the original Taylor rule. Okay? The ghost is back. It's Ben Bernanke. Doesn't like me using his stuff. All right, so where does this leave us? Well, you know, the reason we're spending a lot of time on this is because this whole notion about trying to make monetary policy decisions, we've been emphasizing these are not easy choices. They have a lot of implications for the economy. There's a lot of different factors that have to be brought into that. And a lot of this discussion started last year when folks started saying that, okay, you know, Fed says it's going to raise interest rates. We don't know when that's going to occur. We don't really know what rate they're going to decide is the optimum long-run rate. Perhaps even more importantly, we don't know the pace at which they're going to move those rates from where they are now to what that optimum level is. And again, just to sort of emphasize that just for a minute, look at this period from the early 90s through 2015. You can see that in some situations, we've had a relatively rapid increase in interest rates. For example, this period in 2003, 2004, you can see a very sharp run-up in what the federal funds rate was. All right. What were they shooting for? Well, again, look at that 4% level. All right. If you kind of take the top part of this graphic, you can see that in the early 90s, a little bit above the 4% there, mostly around the 5%. You can see when rates did rise in 2005, 2006, they rose sort of right around that 4% level, if not a little bit higher. But the point here is, if the Federal Reserve were to start raising interest rates from here, basically from zero, at what level are they going to go to? And again, how quickly would they do that? All right? And so that has been some of the discussion that started last year. And again, that provoked some responses from the Federal Reserve. This particular piece just simply is pointing out Janet Yellen as chair of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Open Market Committee, sort of arguing that this is not a very good way to go. That, guys may think in Congress that this is helpful as a way of thinking about monetary policy, but we really don't think this is a very good idea. As she refers to it here, she said that would sort of suggest a certain amount of political meddling in central bank policy. And if we go back to some of our principles we said for central banking, one of the key elements of central banking is independence of the decision-making process, and that's important for central banks to maintain that kind of independence. Well, that has not necessarily deterred some of those in Congress. This is an article by Jeb Hensarling, representative from Texas, who's chair of the House Banking Committee. And very recently, this particular article was from mid-November. Right about that same time, the House passed a bill that would essentially change the way that the central bank operates. One of the key features that I'll highlight here, this bill is referred to as the Fed Oversight Reform and Modernization Act of 2015. And they basically say that as part of this, that monetary policy must follow some kind of a rule, some kind of basis for making decisions about what interest rates would be. One of the things that those proponents of the bill and of this approach have argued is that it does allow discretion. And as you see here, quoting from the article by Hensarling, the Federal Open Market Committee has unfettered discretion to choose a rule or method for conducting monetary policy. But basically they must publish what they're doing and explain in situations where they deviate from that rule, they must explain why. Okay? Now that raises the question, who do they explain why to? And what is it that would trigger some kind of a response from whoever they're explaining that to say, well, you shouldn't be doing that. All right? One of the ways that the bill is currently structured would have the Government Accountability Office be the one who would monitor whether the Federal Reserve was following its rule that it would propose. Then the question is, okay, well, what does the Government Accountability Office do if they say that, okay, well, the Federal Open Market Committee is not following its rule. They've decided to change the way that they're going to approach monetary policy. It's not real clear what happens. Do they go down, put the Federal Open Market Committee in handcuffs and take them to jail? What do they do? Okay, and that's been a very contentious aspect of this. Needless to say, this has also fostered some strong blowback from the Federal Open Market Committee and Janet Yellen, as well as other members. Again, here, I think this is just, again, a couple of weeks ago, a letter to both the party leaders in the House, making the point that this is not a very good way of doing things, referring to this as a significantly flawed approach to trying to make monetary policy. And again, we've seen folks like Ben Bernanke, for example, coming out also critical of this kind of monetary policy by rule kind of approach, arguing that, well, yeah, you know, some of the things that we may have done in the past, you could track relatively well, saying that, well, yeah, maybe that was the rule that we were using, and that's sort of what he was doing here. But the problem is, he says, that's not how we got to the decision. We didn't calculate what the federal funds rate should be based on any kind of rule. We used a variety of other factors. As Bernanke would argue, we employed a lot of discretion in looking at the economy and making decisions about what we should actually do in setting up monetary policy. That would certainly apply to the use of the unconventional tools that we've talked about, because, as we've pointed out, federal funds rate is only one part of the full tool-making kit that the Federal Reserve or any central bank has. And so this kind of monetary policy rule really only speaks to part of what the overall central bank policies might be. So anyway, this is, again, something that is an ongoing discussion. It'll be interesting to see how far this gets pushed as we go into the new year, and whether or not the House, and in particular the Senate, is willing to sort of adopt this kind of approach. There's, just to add a little politics to this, some who would argue that this whole approach is really motivated more by politics than it is by economics, in particular because if we were to go back to this particular quote that I pulled from that article by Jeff Enterling, if I were to put in the next paragraph down here, which I was tempted to do, but I said, no, let's keep the politics out of this. But if I were to put that in, the next paragraph simply is a one-word paragraph. I'm sorry, a one-sentence paragraph, in which it basically says that the Federal Open Market Committee has been compromised by the politics of the recent time period, because all of the Fed governors right now have been appointed by President Obama. And the chair of the Federal Open Market Committee frequently meets with the Treasury Secretary. The Treasury Secretary, frequently meets with the Treasury Secretary, but only testifies in front of Congress twice a year. And if you read that sentence paragraph, first of all, you've got to scratch your head and say, well, first of all, you know, whether people decided to resign or not during their terms, remember, members of the Open Market Committee are appointed for 14-year terms, okay? So potentially there's not going to be that situation where you have only one president appointing all the members. It just happens to be that way this particular time. The other part of this is that, you know, it's the chair of the Federal Open Market Committee and the chair of the Federal Reserve to work closely with the Treasury. That's what they're supposed to do. So if they're meeting frequently, that's what they're paid to do. So why are you objecting to that? More importantly, if you've only testified in front of Congress twice, well, guess what? That's all you're required to testify about. Congress can require and ask the chair of the Federal Open Market Committee to come and testify whenever they want. And frequently, during 2008, 2009, the chair of the Federal Open Market Committee did testify in front of Congress quite frequently. So you have to read that and kind of take it with a grain of salt. It sounds like a substantive criticism, but it really doesn't have much real meat to it if you get down to the actual facts of what are going on. So anyway, this is, again, a very important element of where we are right now. But this tool, this Taylor rule, also is used by a lot of economists to think about what federal fund rates are and also what interest rate levels will be in the economy. Here we talk about it in the way that I've said we like to think about monetary policy. We want to use it as a tool to think about what's going to happen in the future, forecast what is going on. And so if we were to do it that way, essentially what we would be asking ourselves is, okay, what would be the output gaps and the inflation gaps in the economy? If we were to use the basic Taylor rule, where would that lead us to expect the federal funds rates to be in some future time period? We could do that in a number of different ways. One is to create scenarios, scenarios where, in this particular case, we have an inflation gap that is below target. There is no inflation above the target, so that gives us some leeway to lower rates. The output gap is greater than 2%, so there's again reasons to have a relatively low federal funds rate in that situation. We could craft other scenarios where here, a second scenario might be that inflation rises to target within 3 years and the output gap falls to zero. If we were to do that, this is a game that forecasters very frequently play, we might end up with something that would look like this. This is something going back a couple of years now where the forecasters were looking at these different scenarios, looking at the possible recovery rates for the economy. And you can see here that based on information at this point back in 2011, they would have forecast that the federal funds rate would have risen above zero sometime in 2014, mid-2014. We know that has not happened. But more importantly, you can see that there's a confidence interval around this forecast based essentially on those scenarios, saying that there's potential uncertainty, things about the economy that we just don't know. There's different weights that the Federal Open Market Committee may apply, and so that's going to add to the uncertainty that we have about what the actual federal funds rate is. But again, the importance here is that the Taylor rule, while it was not intended as a forecasting technique, was originally intended simply as a way of saying, can we sort of go back and use our tools of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to look and see how the Federal Reserve actually made decisions. Does it fit with what we see in the aggregate demand and supply framework? And obviously the answer is yes, it does. But now people have recognized that, again, it might potentially be a forecasting tool. So this is one way of thinking about what may happen in the future. The question, of course, is looking at what is actually going on in the economy. We sort of have to say, okay, well, we know that we can get fairly good information about what's happened in the past. Here you can see a track of what unemployment levels have been, what inflation levels have been. We can certainly look at that in terms of what we might think of as the inflation and the output gaps, all right? And so here you can see that if inflation of approximately 2% is our target, you can see the current levels of inflation are quite a bit below that, so we have essentially a negative inflation gap in that situation. Here you can see in the orange line the unemployment rates. You can see again that those have come down very substantially from what they were back in 2009, 2010. The question would be, at what point does the output gap completely close? All right, that might be a question that hinges on our expectations for what the potential level of output in the economy is. And we said earlier that, well, we could always know the potential level of output because that's something that we could look at long-term growth trends and project from those, very much like that upward moving line that I showed you earlier. That would be one way that we could do that. Another way might be, again, to look at unemployment rates. But then the question that we have to face, is what particular indicator of inflation are we going to use, of unemployment are we going to use? Here, something that we haven't talked a lot about, and I'm not putting a lot of emphasis on this, but the different measures that we could potentially have of unemployment. The blue line in the top up there, if you look at that, is what the official unemployment rate is. That's based on different criteria about people who are actually looking for jobs and a whole variety of other things. Those that lie above, particularly the green line, okay, represent different criteria for determining whether or not people are unemployed. As you can see, if you look at the very top up there, that includes individuals who are only working part-time, Uber drivers, for example, who may have some desire to be full-time workers, but because, for example, the economy may not be really at the potential levels of output, they could be classified as unemployed. All right? And you can see that, again, there's divergences between these different measures. The question would be, quite obviously, which measures are the Federal Open Market Committee members focusing on? That is a potential source of uncertainty that will weigh in on what we might expect if we were to say, okay, I'm going to try to forecast what's happening in the future. So the point of this is that this Taylor rule forecasting approach is one way of thinking about what's going to happen in the future. Again, like many things in economics, there is no one clear-cut answer because there are potentially different things that we can use as information to factor into this forecasting process. Yeah.
Back to that one slide with the unemployment. The gray line, that one was the unemployment, and that included the discouraged workers. So that would be like the
green line includes the discouraged workers. The blue line is the one that discourages the part-time workers are not included. Okay. Because they do have some kind of employment in that situation.
And that has does that have a pretty big effect on the output gap, or?
Well, let's look at the numbers here. Okay, I mean you're looking, if you look at the blue line, most recently we're at about 5.8, 5.9, somewhere in there. The green line would put you up at about 10.5%. So yeah, that's a pretty significant difference.
And does the Fed take the green line into account as well, or just mostly?
If we look at the minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee meetings, they talk in fairly general terms about different measures of slack or tightness in the labor market. They're never very explicit about which particular measure here that they're using. Okay? But yes, it's very clear that they know about all these alternatives and think about what those different measures can potentially show. Okay. The other part of this that has gotten a lot of people's attention recently is the levels of employment, labor force participation. One of the things that people have been concerned about is relatively low levels of labor force participation in recent years. People are doing something else besides wanting to participate in the labor force. And you can see how that has tailed off since the Great Recession. Some people have argued, okay, well, this is a result of a bad economy. Other people have said, no, it's because you got a lot of people approaching retirement years from the baby boom generation. They're kind of not so willing to be in the labor force, and so they're withdrawing from the labor force. We have others who, again, might be in this Uber economy, may not be fully measured as a result of that. So this is another one of those economic statistics that can have a lot of different alternative explanations. All right? Again, there's no one clear-cut answer. We can see the trend, but we're not necessarily sure we know what is the cause of that trend. All right? And that quite obviously leads to a lot of concern and other things along with it as well. All right, so where does that leave us? Well, okay, it leaves us with the situation where you say, okay, well, if I did want to forecast, is there anything else that I might use? And the simple answer to that is, well, yeah, okay? I maybe said earlier that we have information at least 4 times a year from the Federal Open Market Committee. We said that they provide their projections, all right, for what they think might happen to interest rates. Real quickly here, come on, we can pass this real fast. The one thing that I showed you was, there we go, was the dot plot. And I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. The dot plot, as we said earlier, was each Federal Open Market Committee member's estimate of what they thought the federal funds rate would be at certain time periods. For example, here, 2015, 2016, out through the longer run. All right, obviously in this case, more than 4 years. All right, but let's also come back to some of the other information that's in here. And what we can see is that in addition to that information about the federal funds rate, the Federal Open Market Committee and the economists who support them also provide forecasts. All right? And so, you know, if you're a forecaster, an economic forecaster, or you want forecast of what's going to happen in the future, well, certainly one source of fairly decent information would be what the Federal Open Market Committee is saying. And here you can see their projections. Again, this is back from September. The red line is the median of the projections. That revoids with an average. If you have some outliers, they could throw it off, so they use the median. You can see that there's an error bound around that. And you can also see what they refer to as the central tendency. And quite simply here, you can see that the longer-term projections for growth in the economy, the period post-2015 here, are right about that 2% that we talked about. Okay? And so that would be their forecast of how they think the economy is going to change. All right? You could also look at what their projections are for the levels of inflation in the economy. I'm sorry. Levels of inflation in the economy. Here you can see, again, going forward in time, that it's not until sometime in 2018 that they forecast that inflation rates would approach their target. Okay? So they expect inflation to stay low for a number of years, okay, into the future. What would it be in the longer run? Well, again, if you're forecasting and you've got a target, well, hopefully you want your longer run forecast to match the target. So guess what it is in the longer run? 2%. All right, so here's where the target and the forecast sort of express the fact that they should match up. All right? If the longer run forecast is for inflation of 3% and the target's 2%, then obviously something's amiss with the policy choice. All right, so that's quite obviously something that we could look at, but again, some part of the answer there, we probably know already, such as we know that the longer run's going to be the 2% figure. We could also do the same thing with the unemployment rate. Here, again, you can see what their forecasts are. Relatively narrow bounds for the forecast. Quite obviously, Federal Reserve not expecting any kind of severe recession anytime in the near future. Expecting unemployment rates to essentially stay right around 5% for quite some period of time. So that would certainly be an optimistic element of what their forecasts are. All right, so where does all this lead? Well, again, if we're forecasting what the federal funds rate's going to be, if that's what our objective is, well, again, go to what the guys who are making the decision, they say they're focusing on. All right, and here, again, you can see that they expect some gradual rise in the federal funds rate over the next 3 or 4 years. they see the long run rate being below that 4% rate that we said if we follow the Taylor rule, right, if we follow the Taylor rule, the long run rate should be 4%. They don't see it there. Okay, they see quite obviously somewhere around 3 to 3.5%. And more likely in that range, meaning that projections for long-run rates are below what they would have normally been prior to the Great Recession. All right? And some financial firms have come out very recently and argued that they think the federal funds projections here that the Federal Market Committee making are overly optimistic. They think they're more likely to be in the 2 to 2.5% range, right? And the reasons why they argue that go back to their projections for growth in the economy. They think that this growth economy that the Federal Reserve is projecting here of about 2% growth over time, but some of these financial firms don't think that those rates are actually going to prevail. They think they will actually be lower than that. And so with an overall lower rate of growth in the economy, that would suggest a lower long-term federal funds rate. Just like we saw earlier when I sort of bend that slide label, bending the Taylor rule. Well, again, I could end up with a lower long-term federal funds rate if I reduce my expectations for growth, reduce my expectations for inflation, and other things that would factor into that. So again, this is another way that we can go about thinking about the future. We don't have to have a forecasting tool to do that. We can just simply follow what the Federal Reserve is saying in their statements to the public. All right, so that then brings us to the unconventional tool side. We've talked about the quantitative easing, asset-backed purchases, targeted asset purchases, aspect of Federal Reserve policy in the last several years. That has been a very, very important component of what they've done. Again, the objective, as we've talked about before, was to lower long-run interest rates through the argument that short-term rates as well as asset purchases in the medium and long term will reduce the term structure of interest rates. That's why we've seen the dramatic growth of the Federal Reserve balance sheet that we talked about earlier. Again, you can see that's expanded from a little bit over 8% back in 2008 to now over 23% in 2013. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's actually would be slightly higher than that right now. And so this has been, again, a fairly dramatic change. The questions that people have raised is, okay, you did that. You argued what the value of targeted assets purchases would be. You've explained why you've done that. Now the question is, what are you guys going to do with all those bonds and other securities that you purchased? All right? What is it that you intend to do with that element of the policy toolkit? You recall we've had forward guidance about the federal funds rate. We had the one back in 2012 where they said unemployment needs to fall below 6.5%, as long as inflation is below 2%. You know, nothing similar at all for these targeted asset purchases. And the question that we have to ask is, well, what are the choices that they could possibly make? All right. One is to argue that they really don't need to do anything. Okay. They could simply allow those bonds, for example, that they purchased, either 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, 10-year, just let those bonds mature. All right. What does that mean? Well, it just simply means that they hold them till there's no longer an obligation. There's no longer somebody paying them off. Right? Remember those mortgage-backed securities, for example, that are part of the assets that they're purchasing? At some point, people are going to pay off their mortgages. And that implies that those mortgage-backed bonds are essentially paid off. Okay? So that's one thing that the Federal Reserve could do with what they currently hold as a part of that portfolio of assets. The other thing they could do is what I refer to here as sort of the grandparent strategy. Remember, part of the reason why the Federal Reserve engaged in all of these purchases of different types of financial instruments, including mortgage-backed securities, a lot of it was to get those assets off the books of the commercial banks. Remember, that's who they purchased them from. Essentially, the banks were in trouble and needed to unload some bad assets. Well, one of the things that they could do, the Federal Reserve could do, is simply sell them back to the commercial banks now that the economy's gotten a lot better. Those assets, the underlying mortgages, are no longer in as bad shape as they were, and allow the banks to acquire them once again. What that would do, obviously, would be to drain some of those excess reserves out of the commercial banking system, and that would certainly have some effect. I refer to this as the grandparent strategy because you may have friends or whatever where parents are having issues, they can't take care of their kids, and so they say to the grandparent, well, can you take care of my kids for a while with the promise that you're going to give them back to me later on? Well, essentially that's what's happening with these assets. The banks could be saying, and have that opportunity to say, well, we'd like to buy some of those assets back again. We don't have a lot of investment alternatives right now. Some of those are pretty good investments, so why don't you let us buy some of those back? Right? And that's certainly what the Federal Open Market Committee, the Federal Reserve, could do. Okay? One of the key things to think about when we think about these alternatives is to realize that the Federal Reserve does not have to earn profit. Remember, it's a separate entity. And so whether they're earning a lot of money or very little off of these assets, regardless of the strategy that they use, that's not a subject that anybody really can comment on. All right? They can earn as much as they want or as little as they want on those assets. The only key that they have to remember, quite obviously, is they have to maintain money to run the system. They have to be able to pay interest on the deposits that banks have with the central bank. Remember, that's something, again, that changed in 2008. So they certainly have to earn some money, but again, the level of profits don't make that much of a difference. In fact, any profits that they actually earn actually have to be turned back to the U.S. Treasury, go back to the public. There's no incentive necessarily to earn a profit there. So then the question is, okay, so what has the Fed actually said they're going to do? Well, again, we can go back to some of the statements that we looked at once before. And here, back in September of 2014, you recall we looked at this once before. What the Fed has basically said was, at the top part of this, the Open Market Committee intends to reduce their holdings of these securities in a gradual and predictable manner. Okay? Not clear how anybody's going to predict that, but anyway, they're going to do that at some point in the future by ceasing to reinvest repayments of principal on securities and other assets held in the system open market account. That's what SOMA is there. The key phrase, though, back in 2014, the current committee currently does not anticipate selling any of these securities as part of the normalization process, although limited sales might be warranted in the longer run to reduce or eliminate residual holdings. The basic point here is that as of 2014 and as of December of 2015, the Federal Reserve has not really given any clear signals about what they're going to do. All right? They have basically said we are going to just simply reinvest the proceeds that we currently have and then move on from there. That has led, quite obviously, as one might expect, to the call for a rule. Following on the same kind of discussion that we've had about the Taylor rule, some would argue that, well, we need some sort of tailored rule type of approach to saying when the committee, the Fed, is going to begin divesting itself of assets. Interestingly, this particular article and the discussion about this was coming from Jeremy Stein, Harvard economist, really more a little bit on the finance side, who was arguing for this need for a rule to let the market know what was going to happen to these assets. When I say it's interesting is because Jeremy Stein's no longer on the Federal Open Market Committee or a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. He decided to go back to academia and not participate in the policy process. But in any event, that has not stopped individuals from continuing to argue for this kind of a need. And just to briefly give you a quick overview of what this, some of the side aspects of this, we've looked at this before. Treasury securities, obviously, is a very large part of it, as well as mortgage-backed securities. The key element here is to think about how long this commitment is. You can see that back in 2007, the light colored bar graphs here would indicate the share of total assets with different maturity levels. Here you can see that in the 6 to 10 and 10 to 30 years, relatively small part of the total portfolio, about 10%. You can see that in 2013, that percentage has increased very dramatically. Same way with the 3 to 6 year holdings. The short-term holdings have gone down very dramatically because of this shift to longer-term maturities. So if the Federal Open Market Committee envisions holding these for some considerable period of time, well, it's going to be 6 to 10 or 10 to 15 years into the future. That portfolio of assets is not going away anytime. The other part of this, just to sort of wrap this up, is what actual results have been. Actual results have been that the Federal Open Market Committee has actually made a lot of money off of these assets. You can see the payments to the Treasury Department since about 2010. They've averaged about $80 billion a year, pretty substantial. Those are excess returns over and above what it takes to operate the Federal Reserve System. You can see that these are obviously quite low, quite a bit lower than what those payments would have been back before the recession and back before this acquisition of these types of securities began. And so that's a very important part of this. And some people have said, well, what happens if interest rates rise? Suppose that we do have an outburst of inflation. What would that mean for the returns to the Federal Reserve? Well, the Federal Reserve, again, has thought about that. They've played out some different scenarios. And even with an increase in rates, the payments that would occur from the Federal Reserve to the Treasury would still be fairly substantial. So the possibility of the Federal Reserve losing money on these assets is actually fairly low. And that's been one of the things that has been talked about quite a bit. Again, in thinking about the strategy here and thinking about what the Federal Reserve may do in the future, possibly as early as later this month, December 17th is the next meeting, certainly the Federal Reserve has to be thinking about what do they do with these excess balances. Right? As you can see here, required reserve balances are a very, very small fraction of all the reserves held in the system. These excess balances are huge by comparison and quite obviously beg for something to be done at some point in the future. We've been going back and forth in our discussions about the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. Well, newspaper headlines today from earlier meetings today in Europe. The European Central Bank, you can see the headline here. The bank decided to extend the asset purchase program. More importantly, part of what they also did was to further reduce the deposit rate. Okay, we talked about the fact that the European Central Bank had a negative deposit rate, meaning that if you left your money with the central bank, you would lose money. Well, they made it even more punitive, reducing that rate to a -3%. Why? Again, they're trying to get the excess balances out of the system, trying to encourage the banks in Europe to put their money to use through loans, taking advantage of the money multiplier, getting the economy stimulated as a result of that. The other part of what they were doing is, yes, increasing the asset fares. I thought I'd find a nice little quick comment in here, but there we go. Yes. So the program, which they're going to buy 60 billion of government bonds, they're going to extend that into the future, extend that through 2017. Remember I said earlier that I thought they would increase the total amount, but actually they're just going to extend it over time. It was originally scheduled to end next year. Now it will go for an even further period of time. So the European Central Bank is obviously not out of the unconventional tools business either. And so it makes for some fairly interesting things to watch as we talked about that. One other headline that we might want to talk about very, very quickly is Janet Yellen's testimony before Congress. She actually does do that to meet the mandates. But in any event, she's fairly upbeat and says that things are looking good in the labor market, not focusing exclusively on the unemployment rate, but saying things look good in the unemployment rate. Many people think that's a signal that the federal funds rate is very likely to be raised at the December meeting. So some very interesting things, hopefully start to tie some of this that we've been talking about together. All right, for whatever reason, I did not get the homework on my thing there, so let's see if I can get this. All right, first homework problem was to define stabilization policy, describe how it can be used to reduce the volatility of economic growth and inflation, and do stabilization policies improve everyone's welfare. You haven't done one for a long time.
Stabilization policies are monetary and fiscal policies.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Stabilization policies are monetary or fiscal policies designed to stabilize inflation and output. Both policies can be used to shift dynamic which partially the impact of economic shock, while policymakers in principle can neutralize any demand shocks. They cannot shift the aggregate supply curve, so we can eliminate the effect of the shift short runs.
Okay. Yeah, the basic idea here is that these stabilization tools can work either from the fiscal or monetary policy side. Monetary policy is particularly effective in dealing with aggregate demand shocks. Can't control prices, so aggregate supply shocks are kind of off the table. Again, why do we do this? Well, again, it goes back to one of our core principles, this whole notion that stability improves welfare in the economy. So that would be one of the things that we would want to do. I'm trying to brighten this thing up, but I can't figure out where the dang. All right, hopefully you guys can see this. I apologize. First time I've had to do this, and I don't know how I messed up with getting it on there. Number 2 was explain why stabilization policies are usually pursued using monetary policy rather than fiscal policy. Oh, you haven't done one in a long time.
Fiscal policy, particularly discretionary fiscal policy, changes the aggregate expenditures and therefore shifting the aggregate demand curve. However, with fiscal policy, it works very slowly. For Congress, it takes some months at least to pass something, and further the implementation of such policy is nearly impossible to effectively implement in the economy. Again, an example would be like a tax cut. But it takes a long time for that consumption to occur, and normally the recessions are fairly short, so by the time that it actually gets into place and is effective, the recession is usually over.
Okay. You also have the problem that even though we might be in a recessionary period, some people may object to the idea that when you have a tax cut, you may increase the size of the deficit. You may also increase the country's debt. Some people find that to be an unacceptable trade-off, although there are pros and cons on both sides of that. And that's one of the reasons why I've tried to emphasize that given where we are on the fiscal side of the house, not only in the United States, but also in many other countries, monetary policy is emerging as one of the primary stabilization methods that governments have. All right? It can be done far more quickly. Central bankers are more astute about what's going on in the economy. Nothing against politicians, but that's not their first job. All right? The first job for central bankers is the economy. So they are quite aware of what's actually happening, and they have the policy tools, as we've been talking about, to try to take advantage of what is going on there. All right, and then the next one is starting with the economy in the long run equilibrium, use the aggregate demand and supply framework to illustrate what would happen if inflation happen in the short run. If there were a rise in consumer confidence, assuming the central bank takes no action, what would happen to inflation and output in the long run? Yeah. Can you speak up just a little bit too?
If the consumers gain confidence in the economy, the aggregate demand curve shifts right, creating a need for more production, which would increase output in the short run. Inflation also will be less due to the increase in aggregate expenditure. In the long run, the aggregate demand will decrease, there will be a decrease in output, causing a
Causing a what?
increase in.
Okay, yeah. The scenario that we're describing here is one where we start at the desired equilibrium. Inflation is at target. Current output is at potential. This rise in consumer confidence shifts the aggregate demand curve outwards. What that would do is to move us into an expansionary gap. All right, and what that means in that situation then is that inflation is going to rise. Inflation rises. What that does is because now input prices are also rising, that's going to reduce short-run aggregate supply. It will shift backwards to the left and return back to potential output, meaning the expansionary gap goes away. But now, in this particular scenario, because there's been no action by the central bank, in this particular scenario, our new equilibrium, while we're in balance with current and potential output, we now have a higher level of inflation in the economy. And that level of inflation exceeds what the target is. Okay? So here we have one outcome, again, without any kind of central bank intervention in that situation. If we were now to consider that same increase in consumer confidence, what would happen to inflation and output in the long run if the central bank remained committed to their target, inflation target, and responded with a policy tightening? Compare that outcome to what we found earlier in all of this. Let me let you go ahead.
So if the central bank tightens policy, the response will be upward movement of inflation and output of aggregate demand curve, and then aggregate demand curve will shift to the left, which will get back to the equilibrium, and then comparing to the previous questions, we have inflation increases, but in our case, in this problem, inflation remains the same. Output remains at Y star, and inflation remains at inflation
At the target.
at the target.
Yeah, this is sort of the classic response that a central bank would take to a situation where, if you will, things are too good. Okay? I mean, there's no other way to put it. All right, you have the initial situation, aggregate demand shifts outward, the Result in this case is because we were originally at full potential output, we now have an increase in inflation. Federal Reserve says, oh, we can't do that, we're above our target, so, we got to take away the fun that you guys are having. When we take away the fun that you're having because of all this increased consumer confidence, what we're going to do is raise interest rates. When we raise interest rates, that is going to choke off that increase in aggregate demand and subsequently bring us back to where we were originally. Okay? Now, again, remember, and this is part of what I've tried to emphasize, the tools that we have at this level are harder to visualize that with. But remember, these are all static graphs. All right? If we were really to look at this, using the dynamic framework that we were talking about, remember, these increases in potential output are going to shift outward. This problem of the increase in short-run inflation may or may not be a problem, depending upon what we see as the productive capacity of the economy. If the capacity of the economy grows enough, that alone could actually reduce what the inflationary pressures are, all right? Because when potential output increases, that can also shift outward the short-run aggregate supply curve as well. All right? So potentially, and I'm not saying that that's the answer to this question because that's not what they're asking, but potentially that short-run burst of inflation that requires central bank intervention that may not really be a problem. And we do see some parallels back in the 1990s. For example, we had an increase in inflation during the mid-1990s. The Federal Reserve at that time said that, well, we really don't think that's going to be a problem. We think it's a short-run phenomena, and we also think that the growth rate of the economy is going to increase. All right? Why? Well, what was going on back in that time was the very beginning of the software and computer revolution that we all have now. It used to be that if you wanted to use a computer, you sat down at a desktop and you had this big old thing, these ideas of laptops and all kinds of software, word processing. In the 90s, if you wanted to have a typed paper, you had to type it. You didn't put it into a computer and have an electronic file. You actually have to type it with a typewriter, because I don't even know what that is, I know. But anyway, the central bank in the 90s said, we think these technologies are going to significantly improve the productive capacity of the economy. So in a similar situation, the central bank really did not take very much in the way of actions to try to correct it. They instead let the economy grow to take advantage of that growth. So again, the policy choices can be different at different points in time. And finally, the question up here first. How could you use the aggregate demand supply framework to explain the impact of the financial crisis on inflation and output in the economy? We have so many people in here that have already well over the A range. I'm trying to give some other folks a shot. Yeah, go ahead. You guys are, I'm not going to name names here, but I got some people that are, already at 1,200 points, close to it. All right, with a decent performance on the final exam will be at least at 1,200. Go ahead.
One can think of the disruption in financial markets as an aggregate demand shock. Lack of access to credit by consumers and businesses and loss of consumer and investor confidence would shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. And in the absence of other changes, it would put downward pressure on both output and inflation.
Okay. And the central bank's policy response might be?
The interest rates.
Yeah,
lowering the interest rates.
Lower short-run interest rates. One of the things, again, that we don't get when we look at the static graphs here, we get a shift of the aggregate demand curve to the left. That's what causes the recessionary gap. If we were to talk about the 2008 situation, we had a dramatic opening of that recessionary gap. Remember the graphic that I showed you where unemployment dipped well below any of the recessions we've had since the Great Depression back in the 1930s. So that recessionary gap was huge. All right, and so the shift of that aggregate demand curve in 2008, 2009 was very dramatic, leading to the recessionary gap and also leading to the levels of inflation being below the target, just what we saw on one of the earlier graphics there. What does the central bank do? Central bank, quite obviously, in that scenario, should lower interest rates, as we have seen. That's exactly what the Federal Open Market Committee did. Okay? All right, so again, thank you for that, and hopefully that's covered any questions that you all may have. Apologize for running over a little bit today. Let me give you a copy of the practice final exam. These are questions that come primarily from the last section, so don't lose your earlier practice exams. They are still potentially useful to you. What I'd like you all to do when thinking about the essay questions is to focus on one of the things we've been talking about in the last 2 days. Right? We've been talking about how we can use some of the models, some of the concepts that we've talked about and learned to think about the future, okay? What we think is going to happen in the future. You guys, become monetary policy experts over the course of the semester. Suppose that you were put in a situation where you had to advise people on what you think monetary policy should be. Okay? What kind of recommendation? Everybody got one back here? Okay. Think about what kind of recommendations that you might make. What kind of forecasts, what kinds of changes or whatever in monetary policy as practiced in the United States. Okay? I'm not going to ask you about Europe. We spent a lot of time on Europe earlier, and I've used Europe as a way of contrasting what alternative monetary policy could be. I tried to show you that the European situation, they're still in a recessionary gap in Europe. They're trying desperately to use the tools of central banking to get out of that recessionary gap. But despite their best efforts, it's still not worked to achieve the full objectives that they would like to achieve. So keep that in mind, but again, focus on what we've learned about the U.S., the U.S. condition. Think about some of the things that we've talked about today. You might go back and look at some of these open market committee meetings that we've talked about, some of these things about the policy tools that they've been considering, some of the notion of the projections that they've made. All of those kinds of things might factor into how you would approach answering the question about what you think would be happening in the future. Yeah.
Would you ever consider putting up all the graphs that you were showing us today on what purpose?
The ones about the balances in the open market account?
Well, yeah, and the unemployment ones and all the ones from that file that you had opened and were scrolling down.
I'll put all of the slides from this last chapter up.
Okay.
There's a lot of stuff in there that's very recent policy.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the difficulty of trying to keep, part of the reason, I used to use chapter 22 and 23, but chapter 23 has gotten so irrelevant. It's been superseded by policy. I'll put the slides up to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Questions? All right, don't forget, 15th, 10 o'clock, if you have questions, I'm around.